It's great to be here. I see many old friends and lots of new friends, and I want to thank Stephen and the staff of this conference, and also False Prophet for making this space available to have this event. This is really great, and when I come here to these things and see that we're all still kicking after so long, and so many young people as well, I have hope for humanity. And we're living in an age when I think we can use all the hope we can get. So it's a pleasure to be here, very much. I wasn't sure exactly of the context of this thing. I'm more used to talking to small classrooms with my PowerPoint and all that. So I have a PowerPoint projector, and I spent a lot of time kind of, I'm not really an expert on this topic. The topic is neuroscience and spirituality. And when it comes to neuroscience, I'm a poseur. There are actual real neuroscientists in this audience, and they will probably think this is a pretty shallow kind of presentation. But this is really just a quick overview, and if I've made really egregious mistakes, by all means correct me. This is kind of new. I'm really just an ethnobotanist, and I've sort of dabbled in the neurosciences because of our common interests. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and hopefully there'll be some time for discussions and so on. And I'm hoping and praying that the technology will cooperate, and if it doesn't, I have my faithful AV guy there who may have to replace this wireless mouse, but we'll go with this for the moment. So as you may know, I'm kind of loosely affiliated with a lot of organizations, and a couple of them are up here. The Hefter Research Institute, which most of you are familiar with. It's a nonprofit organization interested in research into psychedelics and development of psychedelics as medicines. We just had our annual or our semi-annual board meeting last weekend, and we had a fundraiser at one of our board members' house, and we're making progress. We have a couple of studies involving psilocybin in terminal cancer patients. I don't really need to belabor this because I think you probably all are fairly informed on this, but it's working. I mean, what started out as a kind of a wild and crazy vision a decade ago is now actually a semi-respectable, if not respectable, organization, and we're making progress. We've had great fortune both in getting support within the community and also kind of navigating the very tricky regulatory waters that you need to navigate to do legitimate medical work with these substances. So we're hopeful for the future. The other organization that is kind of my real job, my day job, I guess you could say, is the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota. And it is not a New Age cult. It just sounds like one. And what it really is the alternative and complementary medicine program within the medical school at the University of Minnesota. And it's a great bunch of people, mostly because they let me teach my courses and do pretty much whatever else I want to do. You can get away with a lot in the context of such an organization. So I teach ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology there. And if anybody wants to know a little more about what they're all about, you can go to www.csh.umn.edu. They've got a lot of things going on in the complementary medicine field. So anyway. All right. So this is what's been called, I can't really even see that, so I'm not, maybe what works here? I was just, it's nice if you can sort of see what you're showing. All right, well, anyway. Put the microphone up and sit over here. That's a good one. Huh? You have a nice crystal here. You know, you'd think they'd get this stuff worked out before the lecture starts. This is better. People hear that, more or less? I don't probably even need the microphone. I've got a strong voice. But, well, there it is. And what is it? It is both sort of the inside and the outside of the universe that we experience. Experience itself, consciousness, spirituality, mind, whatever you want to term it, all sort of comes and is filtered through this 3-pound piece of gelatin and protein. And it's a remarkable structure, and it's a very hard structure to understand. But we, you know, in the course of history, it wasn't always that we thought that mind or consciousness was localized in the brain. And I'm not even sure we understand that now. But there is a sort of emerging consensus that whether or not it's localized in the brain certainly has a great deal to do with consciousness and with mind. So perhaps by looking at the brain in more detail, we can understand more about what is this phenomenon called consciousness that we all experience, that consciousness are us in a certain sense. I guess one of the other things that might be worth remarking about when you think about the brain, it's probably one of the most complex structures, one of the most highly organized structures in the known universe, certainly in our universe. There is nothing more complex or more highly organized. And there has been one of my kind of interesting speculations about consciousness is that perhaps it is that consciousness is a function of order, highly organized systems, in the same way perhaps that gravity is a function of mass. And just as when you accumulate a lot of mass in a small space, in a small enough space, you get the black hole phenomenon. It wraps space-time around itself and it plunges into, it becomes the singularity. And the interesting thing about the singularity is we can put a label on it, singularity, but what that means is that we can't say anything about it, because within the boundaries of that singularity, all the laws of physics are abrogated, or we don't even know that. We don't know what is going on inside the singularity. And so perhaps consciousness, as we experience it, is the same way. When you accumulate enough order in a small enough space, maybe consciousness emerges as a property of that ordered system. And if you look at the human brain, that's kind of the ultimate expression of this highly ordered system, and why it seems to partake of a level that's a little different from other forms of consciousness, but to some extent everything that's ordered has consciousness or mind as a property of it. Well, who knows, but that's just an idea, you know. I mean, this sort of, you know, goes back to the notion, as far as Aristotle and even earlier, that the brain and the mind are intimately related. His notion that the brain was the place where all senses met in common, from which our term common sense arises, sort of articulates this idea. But it's difficult for us to step outside of our head. How are we going to understand the brain and understand consciousness if we're within the cage? How can you understand experience and the parameters of experience and the physical substrate, if there is such, or the metaphysical substrates that give rise to it, if you can't get outside of it? You know, so we have the classic situation that a fish might face in trying to understand water. How can he or she, whatever the fish is, step out of the environment and look at it from the outside? This is very difficult. The brain is the filter that filters everything. So how do you understand the filter? And that's why it's difficult to study this kind of thing. And not just we can study it, but understanding is elusive. And we've seen historically the way that the concept of consciousness, the mind, and its relationship to the brain and the body has evolved over time. Descartes, the guy who came up with the "I think, therefore I am" cliche, good place to start, he was preoccupied with the pineal gland, which is now historically re-emerged to become, again, very important possibly in understanding the basis of consciousness. But he postulated that the pineal gland, which is a tiny endocrine gland in the middle of the brain, in the absolute middle of the brain, sometimes made analogous to the third eye, and it is in the right spot. If you drilled a hole right there and right there in the middle of the skull, you would be very close to the pineal gland. And it does have eye-like properties in some ways. But he claimed that the pineal gland was the receptor of all sensory input, and then through a series of strings, it was connected to muscles. It was connected to the ability to respond to the environment. And so it was sort of like the puppet theory of consciousness, all mediated by this controlling center, which he equated to the pineal gland. Stephen, does anybody have any water? I knew I was going to. That would be good. So as we've looked at the way the understanding of the brain has evolved over time, it gets sort of progressively more complicated, which you would expect as empiricism. And actually, as in the second slide I showed, people became enthusiastic about describing what is actually out there in nature. And numerous cadavers, willingly or unwillingly, devoted their body parts and their brains to the early anatomists who didn't really think of themselves as scientists. I mean, science emerged later as even under that term. They thought of themselves as natural philosophers, people who were trying to learn from nature. And as people, as models of the brain evolved, it kind of, the perception of it changed as a place where there was a repository for the spirit. And that's kind of on the upper slide, this early notion of Da Vinci's drawing. There was an early notion that the mind-body is run by humors, which were sort of variously conceived as gases or liquids. It wasn't quite clear. You find very much the same sort of notions in Chinese medicine and other traditional medical traditions. But in the West, it came out of Galen's notion that everything is controlled by these vapors or these fluids kind of floating around the body. And there was this idea that within the brain, there wasn't much happening in the brain. It was mostly empty inside your head, but it was a repository for these gaseous vapors that occasionally had to escape out into the world. Well, as people started looking more at the empirical structure of the brain, the picture got considerably more complicated, as you can see by the picture below. And in the 19th century, there came to be this understanding that not only was the brain a very complicated structure, but there was an effort made to segment the brain and to kind of map brain structures onto functions. What part of the brain controlled memory? What part of the brain controlled, love or lust? Or what part of the brain controlled, all of the behavioral and spiritual aspects that goes into complex human behavior? So one early example of that was phrenology, which was really a kind of a 19th century pseudoscience, but that postulated that essentially by measuring the bumps on your head, you could determine personality type. And they had, all of these complex maps about where on the skull, corresponding to places within the brain, these different functions were located. So this was really kind of an attempt, kind of a stepping stone along the way toward what eventually emerged as modern neuroanatomy, which plays much the same types of games, but hopefully is a little more empirically based. I mean, if you contrast this three-dimensional figure here with the cross-section of brain structures with Da Vinci's drawing in back of it, you can see how much our concepts have changed over time. So now we're still a long way from figuring it out. I don't want anyone to get the impression that we have it figured out. We don't. And any time in just about any discipline or any tradition, when someone tells you they've got it figured out, that's pretty much when I walk away, because there's a lot left. But we do know a few things. We have succeeded in localizing, in sort of defining anatomically different parts of the brain and sort of mapping in a crude way certain functions onto these different parts. And this just shows some of the main parts, like Wernicke's area has to do very much with language, production and processing. The visual cortex, the part of the brain that processes visual information, shows up at the back of the brain. The temporal lobe, the temporal meaning it's located in the temporal area, it turns out to be maybe a key area in certain functions related to consciousness, and so on. So we're getting a progressively more complete sort of map of these different parts of the brain, and through neurophysiology and other techniques and toys that we're inventing, we can look at the functions of these areas in progressively more detailed way. So we are learning slowly. And one of the things we're learning, and here I have to refer to my notes because I can't memorize all this stuff, but one of the things that we're learning is that the human brain, and to a certain sense all mammalian brains, are at least three brains, and they work together. And they are evolutionarily related as well, in that the lower brains, the so-called brain stem, and the midbrain are evolutionarily lower, evolutionarily more ancient than this kind of overexpressed and hypertrophied forebrain, which is kind of the characteristic both curse and blessing of the human condition. and in some sense an evolutionary accident. I mean, we could go on all day about how this happened, but it is really the kind of, it's really evolutionarily what sets our species aside from other species. Yeah, I mean, it's an evolutionary accident in that it happened very quickly in evolution. There's just this explosive, almost literally overexpression of the cortex, of the forebrain, in evolutionary time over a couple of million years. And what triggered that, we don't know, or what led to it, probably a variety of factors. I don't think it's as simple as we started eating mushrooms and suddenly got smart. But I think that these psychedelic molecules were out in the environment, and I think that they did play probably some kind of role. And I'm not really here to convince you one way or the other of that. But you know, how this came about, we don't know. But that it came about, and it has made all the difference in the sense that, you know, as a result, a species emerged on the planet that is kind of the chaos factor in kind of the evolutionary unfolding of life on this planet. I mean, it's pretty clear we're either going to wreck it or we're going to sustain it, and it's still up for grabs. But I just wanted to mention some of these structures to give you an idea of where the state of the art is, or where the current understanding is in trying to localize these parts of the brain and map functions onto parts. So I'm just going to kind of read this out. And I don't have a pointer, so it would be easier. But this part here, you've got the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. And the hindbrain at the bottom there is the oldest part of the brain evolutionarily, and it includes these three main structures: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the cerebellum. And sorry that these words are so confusing. This all came out of the Greek and Latin when that's what neuroanatomists at the time used. But the medulla oblongata is kind of the motor control center of the brain. It controls autonomic functions such as our breathing and our heartbeat, our salivation. It's pretty much independent of conscious control, although indirectly we can, of course, control some of those things. But the medulla oblongata is like an autonomic control system that makes sure all systems are functional more or less, and when its function is interrupted, you're in big trouble because you're dying. The pons contains a duct through which the cerebral cortex communicates to the cerebellum. So this contains also the motor neurons that control things like your facial expression and your mastication, ability to chew, and things like that. And you'd be surprised how much of the brain is devoted to controlling things like the facial muscles. And not too surprising, because that's intimately tied into language. The cerebellum, which is located on the dorsal surface, that is the hind surface of the hindbrain, controls things like posture, balance, and autonomic muscle contraction. So that's kind of like your balance center. Now, when we go to the next evolutionary part of the brain, the midbrain, we can look at substructures there too. And it contains centers for receiving and integrating a lot of different types of sensory information. It's kind of the auditory, visual, integration, and relay station. And if you look at a lot of these different brain structures, you find that they're, you know, roughly you can say many of them are involved with receiving signals and sending signals out, but then where the really important action is going on is where these signals are integrated and kind of synthesized into something that makes sense, i.e. our experience. So the midbrain and the hindbrain together can constitute this thing called the brain stem, and that's basically where all messages, or most messages, enter and leave the body through the spinal cord. Controls involuntary reflexes, autonomic body functions like breathing. It also helps to maintain alertness. It has functions in whether we're dozy or more awake. Hopefully, most of you are not dozy. We haven't had lunch yet. But the forebrain is where it begins to get more interesting and more pertinent to conscious functions. It's involved in things like pattern recognition and image formation, memory, association, our ability to learn, emotional expression. That kind of action, which we experience as, inseparable and intimately linked to our experience of being human and interacting with other humans, is pretty much mediated by the forebrain. And the forebrain is made up of the diencephalon and the telencephalon, again, these older Greek words. And the diencephalon contains two integrating centers, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. I hope you can see this chart because I can't see it that seriously. But the thalamus is kind of important for maintaining the body's internal environment. Another homeostatic mechanism, controls a lot about body temperature, for example. It helps process sensory signals, except olfactory signals, which are processed somewhere else. Controls blood pressure, has to do a lot with our wake-sleep cycle, and controls the pituitary gland, which is another master gland in the body, which is shown up here, a kind of a teardrop-shaped gland that hangs down from the thalamus. And the pituitary gland is always prominently shown in these diagrams, and the pineal gland is almost never shown. So it sort of gets short shrift. That's part of the reason is we know a lot less, but it's also deeper in the brain, so it's harder to depict it. And the hypothalamus, below the thalamus, is located at the base of the brain, and this has to do with our body temperature again, with our osmotic balance, with regulating electrolyte balance in our body. The telencephalon contains the cerebral cortex, and this is this enormous overexpressed hypertrophied structure that we think of as mediating much of consciousness, and it does, but it works very closely with many of these structures in the midbrain as well. The frontal cortex is bilaterally symmetrical. It's divided into two hemispheres, as you know. It's about 85% of the mass of the brain. So the brain in humans is roughly 1,500 grams, and the cerebral cortex is most of that. And then the two hemispheres are connected by this band, very dense, broad band of fibers called the corpus callosum, and they're like a switching system so that the two hemispheres can communicate with each other. And as you probably know, in some cases of epilepsy, sometimes they surgically separate those things. They actually will sever the connection between the hemispheres, and it does dampen down some of the epileptic behaviors, but it leads to some very strange effects too in terms of perception and ability to recognize objects. You can, for example, hold a ball or a block of wood in your hand. You know what it is, you can draw a picture of it, but you can't name it and things like that. So by looking at things like that, this is how we partly learn more about what is going on in the brain and how brain structures and functions do relate to consciousness. I mean, sadly, I guess, or in some ways fortunately, a lot of what we know about the brain comes from looking at brain injuries and what happens to people's perceptions and behaviors and so on when they get odd and exotic brain injuries of various types. So the cerebral cortex, this these two hemispheres contain sensory and motor areas involved in processing of information and the integration of information, as we said. And the cerebral cortex controls sensations, reasoning, memory, problem solving, and voluntary actions, at least to the extent that we have, been able to localize those functions to different parts of the brain. So if we look closer at these hemispheres, where a lot of the action is, you can subdivide these into basically 5 lobes. This is classically how it's done. The frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital lobes. The frontal lobe is the largest, and it controls speech, thought, consciousness, and voluntary body movements. Well, that's a big statement. I'm not sure it does control consciousness, but it controls some important functions related to consciousness. The parietal lobe controls sensations such as touch, pressure and pain, texture, and position. And also within the parietal lobe is a neural map of our motor functions, the so-called, sometimes called the cortical homunculus, essentially a representation within the brain of the structure of our body. And if you've looked at neuroanatomy text, you've probably seen this odd representation of the body where the lips and the face are 90% of the cortical homunculus, and the rest of it is kind of like an atrophied, withered part of the brain controlling the rest of the body. So much of the parietal cortex is devoted to controlling our facial muscles. And the occipital lobe is located at the back of the head and is involved in things like vision and hearing, also in reading. Vision and reading. The temporal lobe is involved in things like hearing, speech memory, sight memory, and music memory. Also, I dare say, mathematical functions, because there is a lot of overlap between that and things like music. Each temporal lobe now also has neuronal connections to the ears, which you would expect. And then there's a structure called the insula, which is not shown, which is located deep within this sylvan fissure, these cracks between the lobes, and that is where smell, olfactory input is thought to be controlled. Don't worry, this is the end of the anatomy lesson. It's not gonna be like that all the way. But I thought, since we're talking about the brain, it might make sense to kind of chart the territory and get some idea. And again, I'm saying I'm not by any means an expert on this. So here's another sort of way to look at it, a more tabular sort of accounting for it, where you can map functions, which are shown on the right there, to particular functional areas of the cortex and particular lobes of the cerebrum. So you have things like the language areas. 2 areas of the brain emerge as very important there. One is Broca's area, the so-called speech center, which has to do with our ability to produce speech, to articulate, to make our mouths move in speech, to utter these small mouth noises that my brother was fond of talking about, these inherently meaningless expostulations of air, and yet from that we get meaning. And part of that has to do with the other area, Wernicke's area, which can take these signals, process them, and translate them into something more or less corresponding, hopefully, to what I just said. Your brain will translate into some model that's more or less close to that, so that we understand each other. And then these different areas involve speech production, involve voluntary actions. I don't really have to go through it. You can see for itself. So there's been progress, especially within the last few decades of the 20th century in understanding the brain. So do we know where the soul is now? Do we know where consciousness is, or where is mind? Which one of these lobes contains the soul? I don't think we can really answer that question, even at this point. No, there's really no better artist than Alex Gray to kind of illustrate the conundrum here. Where does the brain stop and consciousness begin, or does consciousness kind of fan out into the continuum? We don't really know the answer where the soul is. We have a much better understanding of the structures of the brain. We can map functions of the brain onto structures. But do we know where the soul is? Not really. All we can do is sort of make some guesses. We've got some good guesses. We're beginning to understand it. And we have some marvelous new toys. Human beings are very good at sort of probing the universe and inventing toys. And if we can probe the universe using gadgets, then we're really happy. And so, you know, clever people have developed different toys, different technologies, if you want to call them, for probing the brain. One of the questions we really, this isn't one of them, by the way. This is an artist conception, but I put it in there because I thought it well illustrated the idea, and to my mind, a question that remains unanswered. But with our sort of pantheist animist bias, if you will, it's a question worth pondering, which is the brain a generator of mind? Is it a generator of consciousness? Or is it more like a receiver of consciousness? Is consciousness, maybe mind or consciousness, is something like radio waves? It just kind of permeates the continuum. But if you have a sufficiently sophisticated receiver, you know, if you have a Bose stereo system or whatever, you can tune in to the right wavelengths, and so that's a different way of looking at the brain. I think neuroanatomists and people with that sort of perspective think of the brain as something that generates consciousness, but maybe that's not what it is at all. Maybe it's just a way to tune into something that is kind of inherent in the universe. Certainly a lot of the pantheist and animist traditions, you know, have this intuition that mind is everywhere, that everything is conscious, that the smallest sand grain or even electron has a certain quality of consciousness to it. So we have developed lots of different, what you might call neurotechnologies, different ways to image the brain and probe the brain and try to get some answers out of it. And try to figure out, try to, in a sense, look, it's, again, we were faced with this conundrum of the filter, looking at the filter. What's my limit on time?
150 you're done?
Oh, lots of time. 150, not 150. Oh, well, no problem. Okay, so if we look at what we might call neurotechnologies, we can actually kind of divide them into a couple of categories. One is all the toys, the gee whiz gadgets that we've developed within the 20th century for kind of monitoring brain functions and examining them. Things like electroencephalography, computerized axial tomography, PET, positron emission tomography, and all these different, very often ways of imaging what's going on in the brain and imaging either brain structures or functions or both. But then coupled with that, we have what are very ancient technologies that have been around for a long time, what you might call altered state technologies. And these are not gadget-oriented generally at all. I mean, the most complex gadget that you might use to practice this is perhaps a psychoactive plant or a psychoactive molecule. Although they don't all certainly involve those things. You have things like psychedelics, which is not at the top of the list, well, not by design, it's just, but you have shamanism, you have meditation, you have prayer. These are kind of techniques that people have developed over centuries to alter states of consciousness. So we can put these together. We can say practice these sacred technologies or these altered state technologies, and then we can put the helmets on or put you in the MRI and see what is going on in the brain. What is it doing when you're meditating or when you're on a psychedelic and so on. So we can hopefully learn from some of that. Here's one example. This is electroencephalography, which has gotten much more sophisticated in the last few years. A lot of brain activity, as we know, is electrical activity. And what electroencephalography does is basically measure these waves of electrical polarization and depolarization that kind of constantly travel across the brain. And the way you do that is by just putting a lot of electrodes in different spots on the skull. The systems we have now are a lot more sophisticated. We can measure many channels at the same time. And we can, by studying the patterns of brain waves with different states such as sleep, deep meditation, excitement, and so on, we can make correlations that may help us define certain states of consciousness, states of mind are correlated with certain electrical states in the brain. Not surprising. Here, electroencephalography has been around for a long time. It's old, but it's been used. Here's another older technology that's becoming kind of supplanted now. This is computerized axial tomography. And it's essentially a way to build up an image of brain structures by taking X-ray pictures of slices of the brain, and thin slices. That is, the computer slices it up and then builds up a three-dimensional image by looking at X-ray images. It's not used so much anymore. I mean, it is still used medically, but many newer techniques are preferable to it because the problem with this is you have to put X-rays on your brain, and that's not such a good idea. It's very useful for as a preliminary way to, for instance, look at brain tumors or to detect brain tumors, which you can see there in that picture on the right. That mass down there is a rather large brain tumor. Interestingly enough, the current most common application of CAT is not so much in neuroscience, but actually in homeland security. Those people putting these bags through that machine, that's a CAT scanner. And so when you go to the airport, your luggage will not be CAT scanned. I hope that we do not live to see a day when your brain will be CAT scanned when you go to the airport, but I'm not so sure given the way things are going. Hopefully they'll have at least a less invasive technique, something perhaps like this. I can imagine having to have an MRI when you step up to the security gate at the airport that will, in 10 or 20 years, be able to tell you, or even less than that, be able to give our intrepid Homeland Security agents kind of an idea of what you're thinking. And I think we need to think very hard about this because the technology will be there, and it is there already. It's very crude, but given another 5 years to develop supercomputers, another advance in resolution of these types of technology, it's not inconceivable to imagine that we will be able to build machines that will read your mind. I'm not sure we want machines to read our minds. And so this is another example. I don't mean to scare you. We're all scared enough. But I think it's something that we have to think about. We have to think about the applications of this technology, because one of the things, I mean, wonderfully, medical applications and as a tool in basic neuroscience, who could argue with that? But then we humans have this, perverse ability to take a good thing and pervert it into a bad thing, or a, more sort of morally and ethically ambiguous type of thing. But anyway, MRI, magnetic resonance imagery, and the variation of it called functional MRI, which is essentially a movie version, a real-time version of brain functions, has kind of supplanted CAT scanning and other types of techniques, because it gives you such detailed resolution of brain structures and to a certain degree of brain functions. It's based on a magnetic technology, so it's not so dangerous as X-rays, and it's basically based on measuring the magnetic signal from protons primarily in water in brain structures. So this particular drawing here shows the activation of certain brain areas in a patient that's been treated with antidepressants after several weeks of treatment. And of course, it can all be computer processed to highlight those, and that's what this shows. Those red areas are the areas that supposedly are activated. So this is a really quite useful window onto structure and function of the brain. Another gee whiz technology is PET, positron emission spectroscopy. As you can see, it has a much lower resolution than MRI, but it tells you different things. It can tell you basically by putting by injecting a molecule into the brain, which is usually glucose, which has been tagged with an atom that emits positrons, those strange quantum things that are the opposite of electrons, as it decays. And these are very short-lived isotopes, short-lived radio isotopes. And as you all probably know, glucose is the food of the brain. It does not feed on anything else. And so what PET basically measures, it will measure those areas of the brain where the most glucose is being consumed, which corresponds to metabolic activity. So if you want to know, I'm thinking about buying an SUV, for example, you can put me in a CAT scan and say, oh, what part of his brain lights up when he thinks about buying an SUV, or what part lights up when he thinks about, chocolate cake, or other things, and so you can actually correlate brain activity to the consumption of glucose in different parts of the brain. So this is useful. And again, you get these kind of morally, questionable technologies. There's a whole technology called neuro imprinting now, or neural fingerprinting, I think it's called, which would be the kind of thing they might apply at airport security gates. But of course, the advertising industry is way ahead. They're already developed this thing called neuromarketing, where they can take focus groups, show them products, and monitor their brain functions, and then they can figure out how to more efficiently tweak those parts of the brains that react. Another important technology is SPECT, which is, I didn't have an animated version of that, and I couldn't find one, but SPECT is similar to PET in that it involves putting radioactive molecules into the brain, and then as those things decay, you get an image. Unlike PET, which usually involves glucose, although not always, you can do interesting things with pharmaceuticals. You could, for example, put LSD or some other molecule, Prozac or some other molecule with the right label into the brain, and then do a SPECT scan and see where that molecule is distributed. Where does it go in the brain? Where does it bind? How long does it take to be metabolized and excreted and so on? And here the detector, the signal that is detected is gamma rays. So that's the other one detected positrons. The PET scan detects positrons. This detects gamma rays, which are even worse than X-rays, even more powerful and destructive to tissues than X-rays. Of course, the amounts that are actually put into the brain are infinitesimally tiny, and it's not something that you do every day. It's something you do for hopefully a reason, a medical reason. So these things give us essentially windows on the brain, ways to poke and probe the brain to watch what the brain does when it's doing various things, whether that be meditating or sleeping or thinking or whatever it might be. So they can then link these things to these altered state technologies, these by and large very ancient technologies, and perhaps get a more complete picture of what's going on. Well, of course, psychedelics are, really useful in this respect. Molecules like LSD and the whole gamut of psychedelic molecules, in some sense, are molecular probes of consciousness. We can design variations on these molecules, and then we can see how do these variations change the subjective effects. And we can also look at how they interact with brain receptors. Most brains, a lot of brain activity, as you know, has to do with receptors, and how a lot of how drugs work has to do with the fact that they bind to specific receptors in the brain, and then they elicit effects that way. So that's what this thing on the right shows. It shows an LSD molecule nestled within the receptive pocket of this protein. These are conceptualizations, mathematical reconstructions. This protein is located in the surface of the nerve cell at the synapse. And so it can only fit in certain ways. These molecules have a kind of a lock and key relationship to their receptors. They'll only fit certain ways. And so you can study a lot about how that goes on. Meditation is another sacred technology, sacred altered state technology, a way to communicate with your deeper self. I don't have to belabor that with this audience. I like Alex Gray's sort of representations. I tend to use his images a lot, with his permission, by the way, because he really sort of gets how intimately these conscious and superconscious processes are related fundamentally to biology. Biology is the ground of our being. So we can use meditation. We can use prayer. And prayer is not unlike meditation. That's another sacred technology. Another technology that focuses on inner states and the kind of communication with the transcendental aspect of the self. But where meditation often is an inner focusing, prayer almost always or very often presupposes a communication with something outside the self. But they have in conscious that there's a transcendence of the self, a suppression of the ego, and a communication or a relationship with something perceived to be larger than the self. And at this point, I think maybe it's good to remind you that all of this is still going on in the brain. I mean, this is the brain that's doing all this. So in some sense, none of it's really outside the self, or maybe it is. But, this is the filter. And we have various ways to modulate the filter. So we can ask, big questions. What is consciousness? Is consciousness in the brain, or does the brain merely detect it? What is the self? And where is the self located? Is it located in the brain? Is it located somewhere else in the universe, a few feet in front of me? Or who knows? big questions. Nobody has the answers. So we're free to speculate, and we're good at that. I want to talk a little bit about some of the research on this. This is an interesting fellow, a neurologist at the Brain Cognition Lab at UCSD, University of California at San Diego. And if any of you are familiar with his book, Phantoms in the Brain, you'll know what I'm talking about. If not, I highly recommend it. He has learned a great deal about the brain by studying people with different types of brain injuries. He's kind of an Oliver Sacks type character. And he talks about consciousness and what he calls qualia. Qualia is kind of our subjective experience of self, our experience of being in the world, if you will. And he's been fascinated by what kind of brain processes have to integrate together and work together to create this sense that we have of being, localized in space and time most of the time, and pretty much a coherent entity, our subjective point of view. So that's really what he is trying to get a handle on by looking at these different types of brain injuries where qualia is seriously disrupted in some ways. People who have lost limbs, for example, or people, if you look into the literature of neurology, you find there are all sorts of really unusual conditions. Conditions, for example, where people are absolutely convinced that they're dead, or that, they didn't lose an arm, their arm is over there lying on the bed across the room from them, but it's still their arm. Just wild stuff that he talks about. But in trying to understand this, he's kind of put together this notion that the brain, our subjective self, is not really one self, it's many selves, about 7, in fact, and they work together, and they crosstalk and communicate with each other, so that the whole is kind of synthesized into this delusion of being a coherent self. Different parts of the brain handle different aspects of the self function. And the whole thing, by our ability to synthesize all this input and output together, is synthesized into a coherent whole. Much like a film, for example. I mean, a film is just a series of still pictures. But if we run it at the right speed, we have an illusion that it's all running smoothly. And that's really what it is. They essentially, these different parts of the self create a simulation of subjective experience. They create a simulation of reality, and that's what we experience. One of his findings that's very interesting to me is how little of the brain has to do with creating this illusion or this hallucination, if you will, that we call consciousness. Most of the brain, we're never aware of its function. It's just kind of doing housekeeping things. And only a few structures of the brain really participate in sort of creating this ongoing process that we experience as the self, more like a symphony than anything else, or the ongoing movie that we're each living through that we call our conscious experience, that we call subjective experience. So he's kind of, all of this model building, he's kind of broken it down into these 7 types of self. One is the embodied self that's responsible for your body image, your sense of, boundaries between you and the outside world. And that is pretty much mappable to the parietal lobes and the projections into the frontal lobes in the brain. The passionate self governs personality and emotions and those types of functions. And that has been traced or is largely controlled by the temporal lobes and a structure within the limbic system called the amygdala. And the executive self is the self that is kind of the I function, or not the I function, but more the decider, the thing that makes decisions and acts on things. And that has been mapped to the cingulate gyrus and projections to the motor cortex. Never mind these terms. It's just that there are, certain functions that he's been able to correlate with these different functions. There's the mnemonic self, our story, our sense of space and time, our personal history. And that is linked intimately, as memory is, to the hippocampus, that part of the brain that, part of the midbrain that is involved in the encoding of memories, and to the amygdala and to the temporal lobes. You see that these structures keep coming up in different contexts. There are relatively few of them. There's the unified self, which is responsible for the filling in the gaps, the telling essentially ourselves the fairy story that is our life, the story that narrates what's going on so that we can make sense of what's going on. And the amygdala and the anterior cingulate gyrus participate in that. There's the visual self, the self that tracks things in the environment, tracks responses, modulates perception and that sort of a thing. We can thank the anterior cingulate gyrus, the thalamic nuclei in the brainstem for all this. This is the part that keeps us from sort of wandering off and stepping in front of buses and things like that. Very evolutionarily useful not to do that. And then finally there's this conceptual and social self, the sort of I function, our self in relation to our fellow beings. And those functions are mediated by the cerebral hemispheres. Well, I'm not laying this out to you as, this is the model of consciousness, because I think all models are provisional. But models can be useful in terms of kind of articulating understanding, and all models are working models until something better comes along. So this is an interesting way to kind of understand this, how we construct this hallucination that is reality, which of course, as Lily Tomlin says, reality is a crutch for people who can't handle drugs. There's some truth to that, because we are drugs, if you think about it. Our brain is full of drugs, and our bodies are too. And so, when we're more or less in consensus reality or in our own reality, we kind of have this sensory neural interface, I call it. You're getting data of all kinds from the environment, most of which we're not aware of. We're aware of a tiny fraction of it. We're aware of the part that we need to process consciously in order to survive. The part, again, that keeps us from stepping off the curb in front of buses. And based on that, we have different types of output. We interact with the real world with other people in several ways. We don't know what the real world looks like. What we know is that we have a model of the real world that we're dealing with, and that's the internally created model. Fortunately, we're pretty sure that the model of the real world corresponds closely enough to the real world that we're able to survive, interact with physical things, and not step off cliffs and things like that. But the degree to which the model and the real world, I suspect, and I think many physicists and others suspect, the actual real world is pretty unknowable. We really have no idea what it looks like. So then we can change the signal in a certain sense. And the model of the real world changes, sometimes a lot, sometimes just a little. We can take drugs, for example. We can substitute a different neurotransmitter-like molecule in our brain. Perception of the real world changes quite drastically. The real world, presumably, doesn't really change, but our perception, our model changes. We can take drugs. We can meditate, we can have genetic problems. Is that 10? Okay. We can have genetic, I don't know if they're problems, but we can have genetic endowments such as synesthesia, ability to translate one sense into another, which some might think of it as an enhancement of perception, and perhaps it is. Or we can have color blindness, or we could be like an insect. We could be able to see in the ultraviolet spectrum. Depending on our sensory, the modulation of this sensory neural input, our model of the world changes quite radically. So another question is, where is God? Why do we have this sense of some higher power outside of us? Is that a brain function? Do we have a God detector built into our brain, or is it more like a God generator? We can actually get a handle on this in some sense. You can take the sort of radical reductionist position that Bertrand Russell took, who was a famous philosopher and mathematician and atheist, and I suspect major curmudgeon as well, who said there is no difference between someone who eats too little and sees heaven and someone who drinks too much and sees snakes. So that's kind of like, he wasn't buying any of it. He just thought it was all based. You could also look at Andy Newberg's work, some of you are familiar with, very interesting. He is looking at using these different imaging technologies to look at different types of spiritual experience. As in meditation, looking at using SPECT, he has shown that people in states of deep meditation show increased activities in the frontal cortex, the part of the frontal cortex associated with concentration, with attention. There's elevated metabolic activity there. And there's profoundly decreased activity in the parietal lobe, that part of the brain that kind of helps localize us in space and time and gives us a sense that we are bounded in space and time. Those functions are damped down in states of deep meditation, so it helps perhaps to contribute to this sense of infinite boundlessness, the ocean of mind that is characteristic of meditation. Another group of researchers in Montreal is looking at the so-called unio mystica, the sense that, which comes usually after years of meditation, of being in, having a union with God. It's Carmelite nuns practice this or strive for it for much of their lives, and it's almost like an orgasmic, sense of union with God. It's something that they will spend years trying to achieve and may never achieve. But what this group has found is that much the same areas in the parietal lobes and the temporal cortex are involved in this experience. They put these nuns into an MRI and say, okay, have the unio mystico. Well, it's not quite that simple, because you can't just call that forward, And I don't know how many of you have ever been in an MRI, but I hear that they're quite noisy. So I don't know. So a lot of people have said this research is bunk, potentially, because you can't just call this up at will. Another interesting guy, Michael Persinger, at Laurentian University, has gone sort of the one step beyond this, where instead of measuring these states, he actually says you apply the right kind of electromagnetic and other energies to the brain, you can create these experiences. It's all electromagnetic energy. So he's created this thing called the God machine, or the God generator. And basically it involves putting a very low-level magnetic field across the cranium. And people experience this in an isolation chamber. And he claims that you can have a sense, everything from alien abduction to seeing your ancestors, to being in the presence of God. And he claims that what it really is a sort of a disruption. Normally our two hemispheres work independently, and although there's communication between them, it's subliminal. We're not aware of it, but he says that sort of obviates that, and you get a much more sort of conscious sense of the function of your right hemisphere, and most people the subdominant hemisphere, where all these, more metaphysical things go on. So he has developed this thing. A lot of journalists have written about it. Some are not buying it. There's an interesting book by John Horgan, which I highly recommend to all of you, called Rational Mysticism, that describes his experience. He had a transient spiritual experience. Persinger's work and construction of the God machine grew out of his interest in temporal lobe epilepsy, which is a really very interesting kind of effect. Most epileptics, we think of epilepsy as something that affects the muscles, and you have a seizure and you're rolling around on the floor and all of these types of things. But temporal lobe epilepsy is really a different thing. It expresses itself in a different way, where the effects of temporal lobe epilepsy can be very much like transcendent meditative states, transcendent ecstatic states, senses of unboundedness. They can also be terrifying. Not everybody is really equipped for that kind of thing, and depending on your sort of response to it, you can say this is wonderful or this is too much. Again, psychedelics are the analogy here. 5 minutes. I'm not going to make it in 5 minutes. We have lunch after this, right? Okay, well, here's temporal lobe patients have certain personality states. There are certain things characteristic of it. A sense of having a divine presence, a sense that everything has cosmic significance. These are kind of personality characteristics of TLE patients. And as well, prophets and sages, and probably 40% of the people in this room are temporal lobe epileptic. So it's a good thing, They tend to be obsessed with theological and metaphysical issues. They have an inflated sense of self-importance. They're egocentric and argumentative. They often write, obsessively. They write long screeds on all sorts of things, and yeah, really. They have transient amnesia, or they recall minute details of events. So, those are and typical statements of transcendent patients. Suddenly, it was all crystal clear to me, right? There is no longer any doubt anymore. This is the moment I've been waiting for all my life. And finally, I have true insight into the nature of the cosmos. So there's something going on, clearly. Here's some famous people in history that most likely had temporal lobe epilepsy. Because the other side of it was all of these people were not only sort of famous for their transcendent visions, they're also famous for their tempers. And rage, uncontrollable rage, is very much sort of a characteristic of that too. So here's another neurotheology, shamanism, which we all know about, the archaic techniques of ecstasy. Now I'm really having to hurry. A lot of common elements are found in shamanic practices the world over. This idea about soul loss, soul travel, contact with the spirit world, death and rebirth. You see this in all these traditions. And Michael Winkelmann, who is an anthropologist at the University of New Mexico, argues that these universals are really traceable to the commonality of brain structures. That is, sort of the neurochemical conditioning of experience that makes it possible for all these common threads to run through shamanic experience. It involves, again, activation of the limbic system, activation of certain neurotransmitters like the opiates. Well, now we get to serotonin and more into the psychedelic areas. There is serotonin on the right. what you might call the fundamental molecule of consciousness, the master neurotransmitter, not the only one by any means, but important. And it arises from a group of neurons in the brain stem and pretty much arborizes all throughout the brain. And there have been some interesting studies lately on different serotonin subtypes. There are many types of serotonin receptors. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter, but it has many different types of receptors. And since I don't have any time, I'm not going to go into this, but this is just a schematic of the synapse. And there's a lot going on at the synapse. Basically, that thing at the top is the presynaptic neuron from which the serotonin is released, crosses that little gap and interacts with various types of receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. This is just a schematic. And then that pipe there is the reuptake transporter, where the serotonin, think of it as a vacuum, where the serotonin is sucked back up into the presynaptic neuron. And you can manipulate that too. Drugs like Prozac, as we all know, the so-called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are like monkey wrenches for that. You throw a monkey wrench in there and the serotonin doesn't get taken back up. Well, there's been an interesting study on serotonin with respect to serotonin 1A receptors, one of these subtypes. A group has found that people with religious or spiritual inclinations have a lower density of the 1A receptors. So there has been an attempt to link spiritual experience to serotonin receptors. Okay. Should I just stop? Should I keep going? Who wants me to stop?
There's a workshop happening that people need to do.
Oh, if people, what should we do? I'm actually not too far from the end. Anyone who wants to go to the workshop, maybe we should just let them do that, or what? 3?
Yeah.
Boy, how about 5? Okay, here we go. I'll just go as fast as I can. Of course, we know that psychedelics interact primarily with serotonin receptors, and so these are these molecular probes that let us look into consciousness. Here is psilocybin using PET scans. And interestingly enough, I'm not going to read all this, that would take too long, but the take-home lesson is that psilocybin and many other psychedelics essentially activate these same areas in the temporal lobe and the limbic system that meditation, prayer, and so on activate. So there's definite involvement of these temporal systems. Here is Dr. Sasha Shulgin, who you all probably know are the Shulgins here? Well, that's too bad, because I wanted to personally thank him, and I think we can all thank him for the work that he's done over decades. He's really a pioneer. Why he has not gotten the Nobel Prize for this work, I have no idea. Well, I have an idea, actually. It's too good, but he has done more to kind of define the neurochemical basis of consciousness than all these PET researchers and all that. And whenever I think of him working in his little tiny laboratory with the spiders in the corner and the leaves blowing under the window, I am really cheered by that notion, because he is a pioneer, and his pioneering work was structure-activity relationships, defining the relationships between the structure of these molecules and our own experience of these molecules. Structure-activity relationships, a simple compound like mescaline, for example, can be tweaked in various ways, and this is what Shulgin did over many decades, develop hundreds of these compounds and test them with a trusted group of very experienced psychonauts. And what he found was that he found many things, and he's documented all this quite extensively, as you know, but take-home lesson is that trivial changes in the molecular structure of these compounds can have enormous effects on their subjective effects, ranging from being completely inactive to being a mega hallucinogen. You can take a relatively small, relatively weak compound like mescaline and turn it into something like DOM, which is much more potent, much more long-lasting. And he's done this for a whole series of things, and I just have enormous admiration for what he's done. DMT is another compound that you're all aware of, and it's very interesting. It's the simplest, one of the simplest hallucinogens, structurally speaking, and it's only a couple steps away from tryptophan, an essential amino acid, which means that it's everywhere. In nature, it's in hundreds of plants, probably thousands of plants. It's in the human brain, it's in the pineal gland, it's in the spinal fluid, and it's a big headache to the DEA who would like to define this as a controlled substance. I don't know how you're going to control a substance that permeates all of nature, but that won't stop them from trying. And the DMT experience has been likened to the near-death experience, very much elements of death and rebirth when you smoke it. It produces a very short-acting, intense kind of experience. And it has even been suggested that a secretion of DMT from the pineal at the moment of death may mediate the near-death experience. Okay. Let me see, where do I want to... All right, that's it. Sorry, I was too long. Thanks. I'm sorry I just can't shut up, you know?
Thank you very much, Dennis. Before we break for lunch, I have a couple of announcements.